What is my favorite movie of all time? That's a question I always find difficult to answer, but today, I'm gonna try. Or at the very least, talk about all of the films that I would put somewhere in my ranking of personal favorites. This video was partially inspired by the fact that around 5 years ago, I made a video similar to this, and in the 5 years that have passed since then, that list could definitely use a bit of updating. I've seen a lot more films since then, my opinions have changed, and some that I considered my favorites then, I wouldn't now, etc. Now, for the purposes of structuring this video, I've taken all my favorite films and divided them into 9 categories, all of which are time-coded down below if you want to skip around. Those categories are comedies, the IMDb Top 250, animated, superhero movies, badass movies, fantasy, musicals, the ones you wouldn't expect, and Rocky. Now I know that some of the films in these categories can technically go in other ones, but I've done my best to organize this video as well as I can. There may or may not be a top 10 at the end if that's what you're here for, but promise you won't skip ahead to that. Who am I kidding? You already have. At least then go back and watch the rest of the video. Pretty please. And finally, before we get into the films, and I need to make this very clear, these are my, BHL Hudson's, favorite movies. This does not mean I think these are the best movies of all time, the most perfectly, meticulously crafted masterpieces by the greatest artists in the filmmaking world. These are the movies that I love watching for one reason or another. There are even some fantastic movies that I would even say I loved, like Boyhood or No Country for Old Men or Snatch, that aren't going to make this list simply because I wouldn't call them my favorites. My favorites are ones that I'll watch over and over again, or I have a personal connection to, or make me feel unique and strong emotions, in a more powerful way than most other films. I feel like most people know what I mean, but want to be clear, these are my favorites, not the best movies ever. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get right into the first category, comedies. I love to laugh, as you'll know if you listen to the podcast. So here are some of the films that make me laugh the hardest, the most consistently throughout, and even on repeat viewings, which is hard for comedies to pull off. Starting off with 2 Shane Black films, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang and The Nice Guys, which I feel I can group together given that they're very similar, but not in a way where one makes the other feel redundant. Both films are carried by the chemistry between the 2 leads, and it's the buddy cop dynamic done perfectly, with 4 amazing performances in these in their own ways, mixed with the sharp, witty dialogue that Shane Black is known for, and some darkly funny moments that allow the films to take advantage of their R rating.
Where is the girl? What did you just do?
The stories are intentionally a bit complex and confusing at times, but it never hinders your enjoyment of the film, thanks to the hilarity coming from the main characters. Of the 2, I'd probably say The Nice Guys is my favorite, just because I love how Black uses the 70s aesthetic, but both are amazing. A classic one, I can't not have Blazing Saddles on here. Airplane's great too, but Blazing Saddles is the one that sticks with me more, maybe because I like westerns. But it's hilarious to this day, which is impressive given that comedy doesn't really age well. At least in a lot of cases, it can feel outdated or just doesn't work with modern humor, but this one does. And it has some of the most quotable and memorable and hilarious moments in film history.
Okay, Jim, since you are my guest and I am your host, what are your pleasures? What do you like to do?
Oh, I don't know. Play chess. Screw.
Well, let's play chess.
And then to contrast that, very modern comedy films, the Jump Street movies are absolutely up there for me. Lord and Miller are comedy geniuses who have made easily 2 of the most memorable and arguably the 2 best comedies of the entire 2010s. It's so rare that a comedy sequel lives up to the original, but that's the case here. Again, carried by great lead performances, and there's some genuine creativity here that you don't see in a lot of comedies these days. But most importantly, always make me laugh out loud no matter how many times I've seen them. My Cousin Vinny, I don't know if most of you have seen this one, but it's an absolute comedy essential. Joe Pesci, Marissa Tomei, courtroom comedy. I don't know if it's just because my family watches this movie a ton that I think it's extremely quotable, but goddamn, this movie's quotable.
Everything that guy just said is bullshit. Thank you.
Which I mentioned earlier, and I feel like for comedies, that's a really good sign. Just a hilarious movie from start to finish, and also a really fun and satisfying one as Vinny starts to put the case together. You should definitely watch it if you haven't already. Another 90s classic, I can't very well make this list and not have Rush Hour on here. You're starting to realize I like buddy movies, huh? But I mean, when done right, it's such an excellent premise. And again, the 2 leads, Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan, are so fun and charming together in this film. It just makes it work, even parts that could be a bit weaker, because of their performances, it's fun. And it's got some pretty kick-ass action as well. Going back to more recent films, I'm not sure if this counts as a comedy, it's more of a mystery comedy. Close enough. Knives Out. Easily the standout film of last year for me. Not only very funny, but just an incredibly well-made, engaging mystery told in a unique way, with a plethora of fun and mostly despicable characters. And while we're talking about films that are comedies but also other stuff, The Edge of 17 and Get Out I'm going to put in here as well. The Edge of 17, in addition to being hilarious, especially thanks to Woody Harrelson, sticks out to me because of how wholesome it is. Or maybe wholesome isn't the right word, but it's a look at teenage high school struggles and romances and relationships and social awkwardness and strained friendships and all that typical teenage high school stuff, but done really, really damn well. And it's very emotionally effective in telling the story. It's funny and sweet and emotional, and I love it. And Get Out is the only horror film you'll see on my list, but this is one of those films that I walked out of the cinema just absolutely buzzing after seeing. The horror's well done, the comedy's well done, the social commentary's well done, performances are great, premise is fascinating. All of that on its own would make this a great movie. But what made this one of my absolute favorite movies is, in horror movies, the characters always do exactly what a normal person wouldn't do. And here, seeing the protagonist do exactly what you want him to do, and carrying it out in such a brutal way after the insane and horrible stuff these people have done, there might be a better word than satisfying, but I'll say this is one of the most satisfying movies of all time. It's because of how well everything is built up leading up to that, this world and these characters, that climax is so crazy and exciting and fun and satisfying to watch. I just remember the first time seeing it, it was jaw-dropping. And again, I was so excited and pumped up walking out of this. Like I mentioned, it's great on so many levels, but that's the one that stood out to me the most and took this from a really clever horror comedy with interesting social commentary to one of my favorites ever. And finally, easily some of my favorite films of all time, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't be in this video, but I mean really close to the top for me, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End, aka the Cornetto Trilogy. I definitely want to make an in-depth video on these someday, but for now, I'll sum it up like this. Genuinely, some of the funniest, most well-thought-out, most clever comedies I've ever seen. And yet the films don't rub in your face how clever they are. You just sort of realize it throughout and appreciate how much thought went into these things, and yet they just make it seem effortless. Some of the most rewatchable films of all time, not just from all the little details to pick up on, but they're so entertaining. I think I probably watched Hot Fuzz 6 times in the space of like 2 months one time. It was crazy. My ranking gotta be Hot Fuzz, World's End, Shaun. I know everyone loves Shaun, and I do too, but The World's End, I think, is criminally underrated. It has the best action of the three, probably the most emotional of the three, with the reveal at the end especially, hitting me in the gut every time. They're creative, they're crazy, but methodically so. It's controlled and planned insanity, so it stays cohesive, but it's still just bonkers. They're charming, they're action-packed and exciting, they have humor coming from every angle, from the performances, from the editing, from the shot composition. They all have happy endings. Well, kind of. Happy endings in a certain way anyway, which I'm a sucker for. They have actual character arcs and interesting stories, unlike a lot of comedies that are more just lazy with that aspect. I just love these movies to death. They make me so happy. That's a good way to put it. These 3 movies make me so happy. On to an interesting category, the IMDb Top 250. Now, a little explanation for this. For one, not all of these are in the IMDb Top 250. What I mean by that title is, a lot of the films I've already talked about and ones I will talk about, like I mentioned earlier, are movies that are my favorites, but they might not rank on many best movies of all time lists. This category is where those cross over. These are those esteemed, more Oscar-type movies that also happen to be some of my favorites of all time. Starting off with what many people would consider the best movie of all time, The Shawshank Redemption. And yeah, they'd have good reason for feeling that way. Beyond how well made the film is and how well told this story is, it's the message about hope that makes Shawshank stand out. And I know I talked about Get Out being satisfying earlier, but this has potentially the most satisfying movie ending ever. I mean, you know he's gonna get out, especially with this movie being as iconic as it is today, and this scene being as iconic as it is today. But that somehow doesn't take away any of that immense feeling of joy you get when you see him go through hell and have this journey for something also he didn't do, and then finally find freedom. One of the most powerful movie moments ever. That entire sequence is incredible, and the rest of the film that builds up to that moment is why it's so effective. Great performances, great cinematography, incredible film. 12 Angry Men is the rare case where you're shown a film in school and you have to analyze it, and you somehow don't end up hating it. At least that was the case for me. Even having to complete schoolwork about this film couldn't ruin how incredible it is. There's something really pure from a storytelling point of view about a film that, given it's based off a play, takes place in essentially one room and then rolls out a fascinating and extremely engaging plot simply based on the dialogue and the characters involved. It doesn't have to have any crazy settings or set pieces, it's just the dialogue and story are that good. I know that isn't an entirely unique concept, especially in the stage play world, but this is the cinematic example that I can think of that does it best. The film is carried by clever writing that, although you can predict where the plot is ultimately going to end up, you're not sure how it'll get there. And the film does a great job of subtly and smartly moving the story in that direction, so you don't even really notice it in an obvious way. It just feels really natural. It's tense, it's interesting, if you haven't watched it, it's a classic for a reason. Definitely check it out. Then we've got a couple Scorsese films in here. Goodfellas, just the quintessential gangster movie. It's Scorsese at his best. It's stylish and brutal, cool and disturbing, funny and tense. It's got fantastic performances, even though I think there's a little bit that could have been cut. Generally, for a 2.5-hour film, it goes by surprisingly quickly, which I think is a testament to how entertaining Scorsese makes these films with his signature style. And also, for the record, I'm personally really anti-cigarette smoking. I don't do it. I don't really think anyone should do it. Although, your choice, not mine. Live your life. But even with that, I will admit, this is hands down one of the coolest shots in cinematic history. And then The Departed, a somewhat different type of Scorsese film, but it's similar in the sense that it's so well constructed and entertaining and well written that a 2.5-hour film goes by like that. Again, stellar performances, a story with a lot of moving pieces that never gets confusing and stays very engaging throughout, that signature, very captivating Scorsese style, and the cherry on top, an awesome ending. And speaking of Matt Damon movies, what an epic transition here, Good Will Hunting. I went into this film having heard the title a lot, but having no idea what it was about, and while I was surprised it was in fact not about hunting, but about a guy called Will Hunting, the rest of the movie was so amazing that I was able to forgive it. Just an incredibly well-written and one of the most emotional films I've ever seen. I finished that movie having cried, and also with a huge smile on my face. It's a film that has a lot to say about life, and it does so through great writing delivered by amazing performances. One of Robin Williams' best ever. Then, speaking of Jack Nicholson, even though The Departed was one movie ago, still, just go with the transition, one of my all-time favorite dramas, and one of the best written movies of all time in my opinion, A Few Good Men. Aaron Sorkin is one of the best screenwriters ever, and his sharp, witty, clever dialogue that builds from a compelling and interesting story is perfectly on display here. I know I have a whole category for badass movies later, but this movie has some of the most badass movie moments and lines ever. And that finale in particular has such a brilliant build-up to then what is such a satisfying resolution, and the whole thing just leaves you sitting there shocked for a moment, as if you're sitting in that courtroom. The writing draws you into the movie's world, and it is definitely a film worth studying if you want to go into screenwriting. Also, random note, but I just love the aesthetic that especially 90s movies have of like everyday Washington DC or like the East Coast suburbs and cities, especially set around the fall time. It's also in Winter Soldier and a bunch of other films. Maybe it's because I've lived there and visit there often. I don't know, it's really randomly specific, but I love that. I just want to put that out there. And then, speaking of Leonardo DiCaprio, again, we're well removed from The Departed now, but the transition still works, damn it. Titanic. Funnily enough, I don't really see this as a movie I'll be rewatching very often, which generally I would for most of the rest of these, but I was able to see it in the cinema, and it's just such an amazing experience of a film. The scale of it, the effects, the way it combines genres like romance and adventure and even horror, it's amazing, and it features the most iconic film romance ever. I just love how complete of a film experience it is, and how well it gets across each moment it wants the audience to feel. Then, to wrap this category up, we've got a 2014 film extravaganza with The Grand Budapest Hotel, Whiplash, and Birdman. The Grand Budapest Hotel, I think, is best described with the word delightful. This story is a perfect fit for Wes Anderson's distinct style, Ralph Fiennes is phenomenal, along with the whole cast, and the somewhat melancholic ending is really poignant and has stuck with me for a while. Whiplash is one of the most tense films I've ever seen. I'll always remember it as the movie where I literally probably ate about 10 kernels of popcorn because I was so glued to the screen. The movie ended, and legitimately, I had to peel my hands off my full popcorn container because they were sweating so much from how intense that finale is. It's a masterclass in building tension, it has a really interesting message, and creates fascinating debates in the viewer's mind about what it means to be great, and about dedication and balance in your life, and of course features a terrifying yet hilarious performance from J.K. Simmons. And finally, Birdman, a film that even if it wasn't incredible, which it is, will always hold a special place in my heart because it was the first quote-unquote serious movie, or adult movie, no wait, that doesn't sound right, Oscar-type movie, let's say, that I watched and genuinely loved. Before that, I thought these types of movies were just boring, pretty much. Probably had something to do with being forced to watch Lincoln when I was 10, and being too young to appreciate that that film isn't boring and is actually pretty great. But anyway, Birdman, I went to the cinema and I was blown away by how much this movie made me feel and think. And that was just when I was, 13, 14? Since then, I've rewatched it many times and found more depth that I didn't see then. On top of the extremely impressive cinematography, the amazing performances, the hilarious and dark and ironic tone of the film with the way it pokes fun at Hollywood and also tells a great personal story, for all of those reasons, it's phenomenal, but why it's elevated to one of my absolute favorites ever is because I probably wouldn't have gotten so much into film today, or at the very least not in the way that I did, if it weren't for seeing this movie. And for that, I'd also like to thank the trailer that intrigued 13-year-old me, who probably wouldn't have been interested otherwise, to give this movie a chance. And then I ended up loving it. I loved it so much, in fact, that for some reason I own 2 copies of it on DVD. I genuinely can't explain this. Now, we gotta talk about some animated films in here. And I realize a lot of these are childhood favorites of mine, so nostalgia and all that, but I have only picked up movies that I've rewatched in my later years and genuinely believe really hold up. And again, you know, it's my list. In terms of Disney films, this one's gonna seem a bit odd. No Lion King, no Aladdin, no Beauty and the Beast. I just didn't really watch those movies growing up, and watching them later, they're definitely good, some great, but over time I've realized, not my favorites. My first favorite has got to be the 1973 Robin Hood film, an exciting, classic heist adventure film that's perfect for kids, that features a genuinely really fun story and good characters. Hercules is another one that's up there for me. This could honestly make it based on the music alone. The Hercules soundtrack is my favorite Disney movie soundtrack. I don't care what anyone says. It's just great song after 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 great song. Listen to those songs more than any other Disney soundtrack by a landslide. And I really like Greek mythology. So this movie's comedic and creative take on this story, adding in extremely memorable characters like Disney's version of Hades or Phil, leads to it being one of my favorites for sure. The Emperor's New Groove, I don't even know if you can call this one underrated anymore, because it's been hailed as the most underrated Disney film for so long that I feel like now it's just rated. But it's one of the most sharply written Disney films ever. One that will make you laugh out loud more than maybe any of them, a voice cast that could not fit better for the characters, a fun and heartwarming story with a good message, great villain. It is Disney at its best. And finally for Disney, one of their modern films, Tangled. This movie is funny, it has a good message, it has beautiful animation, really catchy songs, and actually some pretty exciting action scenes. Then, still on Disney, kind of, Pixar. Again, it might shock some people that there'll be no Toy Story or Finding Nemo or WALL-E here. Great movies, but not my personal favorites. My 3 personal favorites have got to be Up, not just for that small moment at the start where the movie rips your heart out of your body and stabs it a dozen times while pouring salt in the wounds, but the rest of the movie, which I feel often gets ignored because of how good the opening is still a really fun time. It gets real ridiculous real fast, but it works for this movie, and the ending is almost just as tear-jerking as the opening for me, but in a much happier way. Then Monsters, Inc., a film carried by an excellent voice cast, and primarily the really fun buddy dynamic between Mike and Sully, which I couldn't imagine working as well with any other 2 actors, plus the writing is fantastic. And I just love the premise. One of the things Pixar absolutely does best is premises, and the idea of taking something as universal as kids being scared there's a monster in their closet, and turning it into there being a monster society that's powered by screams, and so scaring kids is a job, and then building an interesting story around that, it's just a great idea with a great execution. And yes, of course, you knew The Incredibles was going to be on here, one of my all-time favorites. I could talk about the amazing animation, or the perfect music, or the really interesting and unique story that takes on the superhero genre from a new, fascinating angle that parodies superhero movies while still creating one of the best superhero movies. But no, I'll leave that for another time. What makes this movie so special is the family dynamic, because despite this being an animated adventure superhero film, this family dynamic feels so real and so personal because of how good the writing is, and the great voice performances, obviously. That's the emotional core of the film, and it's pulled off flawlessly, in obvious and subtle ways. And that's why I think this movie stuck with so many people. It explores real-life, relatable family issues on different levels, but through this over-the-top, exciting superhero story, and that's still so impressive to me. Moving on from Disney to a film that I will forgive for giving me countless nightmares as a child, because it's so good, Coraline. Coraline is such a brilliant movie in so many ways. The only complaint I really have with it is, I would like those hours of sleep that I lost back, please. But in all seriousness, it is a superbly animated film. The weirdness of the animation in the world and the story works perfectly to make such a creepy, unique, yet still fun movie. The animation style is also perfect for bringing Neil Gaiman's book to life. And to be honest, this is probably the best version of this film you could make that wouldn't actually, scare kids to death. Because I remember the book scared me way more than the film ever did. But the way this world is built up and then slowly unravels, it's a tense, fascinating, and delightfully strange film. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, a film that just gave me tons of positive emotions while watching it, and today is one of the only films to ever make me cry from happiness, The Iron Giant. The best way to describe this film is magical. It takes a pretty standard premise and makes it so much more than that with the execution. The music, especially in the big triumphant moments, is fantastic and helps fuel those strong emotions. The relationship between the giant and Hogarth is great. Other characters are extremely fun and memorable, and that ending, man. That ending. And finally, in this category of animated films, I can't very well not mention DreamWorks here. I know this isn't an especially critically acclaimed film, and no, it isn't like a beautiful work of art masterpiece, but Madagascar is still one of the funniest kids films I've ever seen, has moments that crack me up to this day. Shrek and Shrek 2 equally are really funny kids films that at the time of their release were a breath of fresh air with their more crude humor and parody style, and again, good messages for kids in both of these films. Flushed Away is an extremely enjoyable watch, and my favorite DreamWorks film, the film that was my favorite of all time from when I was 7 till I was about 12, and I still hold in very high regard to this day, Kung Fu Panda. Kung Fu Panda is one of those films that you might see the premise or the trailer for and think, yeah, this looks like just another kid's movie. And then you watch it and are blown away by how good it actually is. Like, yes, for kids, it's fantastic. It's exciting and funny and fast-paced and has fun characters and all that. But just as a movie, it has an incredible soundtrack, and the animation manages to blend a ridiculous cartoon style with beautiful shots and scenery. And the action scenes are absolutely amazing. The animation and movement of characters and sense of fun mixed with tension is perfect. And again, the jokes still make me laugh to this day. It has a training montage that still gets me just as hyped up today as it did when I watched this 10 years ago, and it has some of the most iconic moments in animated film history. Now, given what channel this video is on, and what films I talk about a lot, it's only fitting that we have a category for superhero movies. Now, I was debating whether to put The Dark Knight in here, not because it isn't amazing or anything, because it is. It's definitely one of the best superhero movies ever made, but it's not one that I'm constantly rewatching like these others, if that makes sense. So, I don't know if I can officially put it on here, but I'll still give it a mention for sure, because regardless, it is absolutely spectacular. Now, the ones that are truly my top of the top. 3 of them come from 2014 actually. Captain America the Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, and X-Men Days of Future Past. I feel like when I loved all 3 of these when they came out, I probably thought to myself, am I just a kid who loves any superhero movie, or are all of these really good? But as time has passed, I've discovered that yes, all 3 of those are really good. We have the funniest superhero movie ever made, filled with a perfect mix of heart, humor, and classic space action adventure. We have a more grounded spy thriller with the best MCU action that takes my favorite MCU character in a really interesting direction, and puts him in a fascinating story that forces him to evaluate his own morals and methods. And we have a pretty perfect example of a fun summer blockbuster. The peak of the X-Men team films that features great humor, really well done character arcs, and this iconic scene. It's just such an enjoyable movie, and also, I think because we've gotten so much amazing crossover content from the MCU since this film, we forget just how cool the crossover of the young and old cast was. And speaking of crossover, my number 1 favorite superhero movie will probably always be The Avengers. You just can't beat the magic of seeing it for the first time in the cinema as a kid, and then rewatching it over the years, and always getting a huge kick out of pretty much every part of the film. Hilarious, action-packed, well-paced, everything a superhero movie should be. And finally, I know this is kind of an odd one out choice, but screw it. This is my video, and I'm not going to talk about my favorite movies of all time without mentioning Justice League Starcrossed, the finale of the first 2 seasons of the Justice League cartoon, which to this day is one of my favorite pieces of entertainment ever created. But I've watched it over the years as I've grown up, and I can't help but still say, it's absolutely phenomenal. I hope to make another video about the Justice League cartoon sometime in the near future, because I have so much to say, but on the whole, that show is extremely well written for a kid's show, and just well written in general. It's very fun, the portrayal of all the characters is perfect, and the action is incredibly exciting. And all of that stuff is perfectly exemplified in Starcrossed, which has a genuinely interesting and touching central conflict at its core, around which entertaining set pieces and memorable moments are created. It is one of the best superhero movies ever made. You can't change my mind. And Justice League and Justice League Unlimited are easily the best portrayal of the DC world ever in my opinion. Perfectly mixing the tones, styles, worlds, everything that the DC universe involves, while still feeling coherent and being extremely entertaining. Now, on to probably the category that contains the most films that will actually be in my top 10. You could title this category action movies, but I feel a more encompassing term is badass movies. There's simply no better way to describe the films I'm about to talk about than badass. And yeah, at least right now, that's probably my favorite genre of film. Entertaining, well-made, exciting, and overall just simply f***ing cool movies. Terminator 2 is an obvious one to go in here, one of the most iconic action films of all time. It's got the one-liners, it's got the badass chase scenes, it's got surprisingly wholesome and heartfelt moments, it's got 90s Arnold doing what 90s Arnold does best. It's a masterclass in how to make an action film. The first Terminator was a great action horror movie, this one leaned more into the action, and I loved it. The Man with No Name trilogy. Now, I may be kind of biased towards these movies because they're some of my dad's favorites, and a few months ago I was able to see all 3 in the cinema in their original form, and that whole experience was pretty amazing. But I mean, just as movies, these are excellent. This might come as a surprise because The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is generally regarded as the best, but my personal favorite may have been A Fistful of Dollars. I mean, if you're talking about badass movies, you'll have a hard time finding a protagonist who fits the description badass more than Clint Eastwood as the Man with No Name. I love westerns, and these epitomize why I love westerns. Beautifully shot, some of the best music ever committed to film, have their funny moments, great gunfights, chases, just excellent westerns. Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade certainly also have to be on here, the 2 perfect adventure films. I never can really answer which one I like more, because Raiders is the one that kicked it all off, and it's such an amazing film, but I do think Last Crusade might be a little more fun. At that point, they'd gotten the Indiana Jones formula perfect, and The Last Crusade is just that, the formula done perfectly. But they're both so much fun, with amazing practical stunts and action, one of the most charismatic heroes in movie history, that iconic John Williams music. and so many genuinely funny moments, especially in the third one.
Our situation has not improved.
You can't watch these movies without them putting a big smile on your face. So good. Spielberg in his prime. Also, rest in peace, Sean Connery, absolute badass in all the roles I've seen him in, including and especially as Henry Jones Sr. This is a less prestigious film, but this is my list, and I'll be damned if Independence Day doesn't make it.
Welcome to Earth.
It doesn't get much more badass than President Bill Pullman's speech to rally the troops to save the world, or Randy Quaid blowing up the mothership, or many other moments in this film. There are some genuinely great visual effects, and the fact that this film is perfectly cast with some of the best stars the 90s had to offer makes it a very fun watch every 4th of July. And let's just forget this abomination ever happened. Now some more recent films. Mission Impossible 4, 5, 6. I'm just gonna throw them all in here. I absolutely love a fun spy film with gadgets and heists and twists, and for that reason, Mission Impossible 4 has to be my favorite of the three. It's the most spy-y, but the other two are just phenomenal action films on their own. 4 and 5 are extremely fun blockbusters, while 6 feels a bit more epic in tone, but it's pulled off perfectly. We have these jaw-dropping action scenes, including the ones where Tom Cruise put his life on the line in pursuit of realistic-looking crazy moments, a very fun dynamic between the different cast members, and again, gadgets and spy stuff. What's not to love? And if we're talking about spies, can't very well not have an entry from the spy of all spies, James Bond, and for my favorite of the films, I'm going for Casino Royale. I feel like this did a great job of balancing a classic, fun, over-the-top spy movie with the darkness and grittiness of something like a Bourne film. It's not too far on either side of the spectrum, which I'm not saying wouldn't work, but for this version of the character, that more grounded, yet still quite cinematic approach and tone works brilliantly. Action's great, villain's threatening, one-liners are on point.
I'm sorry. That last hand nearly killed me.
The Bond girl is actually an interesting and well-developed character, Craig is fantastic, the story is well executed, it's what you want from this kind of movie. And speaking of spy films, I definitely won't be leaving out my favorite spy film of all time, which also takes the piss out of a lot of spy films, as the main character of this would probably put it, Kingsman: The Secret Service. Watching this in the cinema was such a joy. It's a perfect, fun movie. Movies don't get much more fun than this one. It's hilarious, it's action-packed, phenomenal soundtrack by Henry Jackman, funny pokes at the spy genre, charismatic actors playing interesting characters, genuine stakes and emotional moments despite the movie being as silly and self-referential as it is. It takes full advantage of its R rating, but manages to keep it fun, rather than becoming outright unpleasant and disturbing. It is an absolute blast from start to finish, and I will never get tired of watching this film. Then, I've got to have some entries from one of the best directors still working today, and there are few people who can make a movie as badass as Quentin Tarantino. Pulp Fiction is amazing, and I thoroughly enjoy all of his films that I've seen, but my two personal favorites that I've decided to go for here are Django Unchained and Inglourious Basterds. I think these two films show off Tarantino at his best. The dialogue is superb, the building of tension is phenomenal, the action is over the top and insane and bloody and incredible, the characters are fun and well developed and brilliantly portrayed, they have incredible soundtracks, they have extremely detestable, awful villains that get what's coming to them by the end, they have quotable lines, and so many badass and memorable moments. They're amazing films. Inglourious Basterds is more like Pulp Fiction in the sense that it brings together multiple stories and does that very well, while Django has a bit more of a linear story, but is by no means therefore less complex or impressive or interesting. I also love the epic scale of these films. Tarantino went big to capture these different time periods, and adding his signature style on top of that makes for really immersive as well as really entertaining films. Personally, Django is my favorite. Tarantino's style just works really well for the Western genre, but both are amazing. Also, the song at the end of Django is one of my favorites of all time. And finally in this category, it wouldn't be a BHL Hudson favorite movies video if I did not mention, potentially, my personal favorite of them all. It does switch off in those, so don't hold me to that. Baby Driver. This is about as well made as a fun summer action movie can be. So much thought and effort went into this to make it as entertaining and complete as possible, as with all of Edgar Wright's films, like we talked about. But this one has to be the one I love the most. My dream is to be a filmmaker one day, and this movie is a great example of why. I walked out of that cinema practically running and bouncing up and down. I was so full of adrenaline, and I was happy, and I was excited, and goddamn, that has got to be one of my favorite feelings in the entire world. When a movie can get me that hyped up, it's truly special. And that's what the action does here. Car chases, gunfights, car fights. Whatever this movie does, it excels at. The music tying the whole thing together makes the film almost feel like a music video or a musical, but not in a tacky way or in a trailer-like way like Suicide Squad, because the music has such a purpose to the story and to the tones of different scenes. The way the film is filled with twists and turns that genuinely caught me off guard is incredible. It's a funny film, it's filled with memorable and distinct characters, and you know what? I like the romance. It's probably the weakest part of the film, but the cheesy 1950s nature of it is clearly intentional, and I think it works for the style of film. Also, this movie is so rewatchable, partly because of how cool everything synced up to the music is, but also just, it's so entertaining. It never gets boring, no matter how many times I see it. If I can sum it up in one statement, my favorite movies make me feel something, and this movie made me feel so many emotions through a really engaging story, and that is the main reason, of many, that I love Baby Driver. Moving on to the fantasy genre. I only really have 2 franchises to go into here, but 4 films. One of them is Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, and the other 3 are Harry Potter movies. Lord of the Rings, I've never been a huge fan of, could never really get into the books, and the first 2 films I really enjoyed watching, and I respect how well made they are, and they have their incredible moments, but they weren't exactly my favorites. Like, after watching them, I thought, okay, that was good, and then went about my day. Return of the King hit me differently, though. I always remember it as the first film that made me cry. When Sam is talking to Frodo while they're climbing Mount Doom, I just started tearing up and didn't stop crying till the end of the film, which, if you've seen the film, you know is like a 40-minute period, so it must have got something right. It also contains my favorite movie speech of all time, and it's just such an epic payoff for such an epic trilogy. It just was satisfying and exciting throughout, and really stuck with me for a while. And like the others, the scale of the film is insane, and it's so incredibly well made. And then, the Harry Potter series was my franchise growing up, both with the books and the films, and I gotta pick 3 of them, for different reasons for each. Harry Potter 1, 3, and 8. 1 is one of my childhood favorites. It sets up this world and these characters brilliantly. So memorable, so fun, an amazing kids film. 8 is pretty much the other side of that. It's the perfect ending. Like Return of the King, it's the payoff to everything. It's emotionally satisfying and riveting, and the darker tone fits the fact that the audience has grown up with these films as they went along. Plus, epic battles. I mean, what more do you want? And finally, Prisoner of Azkaban, for me, is the most complete film out of the series. The story is really interesting, the more twisted tone and almost gothic style that Guillermo del Toro brings works perfectly for the gradual shift in tone for these films as the characters get older. Pretty much everything good about the Harry Potter films is on display in this film. The music, the world building, the fun dynamic between the main characters, terrifying moments that traumatized me as a kid. It's a well-paced, great film. Yes, it does contain this moment, which isn't great.
He was their friend, and he betrayed them. He was their friend!
But besides that, it's definitely the best Harry Potter and my favorite fantasy film ever. Alright, now I've decided to create a category just for musicals, simply because I discovered while writing this, there actually were enough for their own category. I kind of went through a bit of a phase when I was like 10, where I absolutely loved Oklahoma and Annie Get Your Gun, Annie Get Your Gun especially. I haven't seen either in many years, so maybe it's a bit odd to put them here, but considering how much I loved these films, how often I listen to some of the songs today, and how there was a moment a few years back where, even after going years without listening to any songs from Annie Get Your Gun, I suddenly realized I still knew most of the lyrics to all of them, so I'd feel remiss if I didn't include these films here. I can't explain how much I love these, it's actually kind of weird. Singin' in the Rain is another absolute classic. I just love the almost magical feeling the film has to it. It's so good at being very obvious that it's a film, if that makes sense. You never feel like this is the actual realistic world, but still completely immersing you in this whimsical musical setting. Also, I love the effort that goes into these musical numbers. The music is amazing, the dancing and choreography is amazing, and what's even more amazing still is how many of these are in just one take. You sort of stop noticing when watching it because it just immerses you so much, but if you think about it, man, that takes a lot of talent and hard work, and it pays off in what is truly a musical classic. And then a film that I love for very similar but also quite different reasons, La La Land. On the homage aspect of the film, this movie pays tribute to musicals of old like Singin' in the Rain, while still being its own unique beautiful film. The cinematography, the unabashed musical style of the movie, the big epic musical numbers, the colors, the planetarium scene, the opening, and most of all, this moment, all work together to bring back that feeling of magic that musicals create. That, by the way, is one of those moments in the cinema that I'll always remember. Gave me chills. And even without that, it's a lovely, elegant film led by 2 phenomenal performances. It doesn't shy away from the more harsh realities of show business while still maintaining the wondrous feeling of this heightened musical reality. It's a touching love story with an ending that will make me cry no matter what. I know people say this movie's cheesy, this movie's too full of itself. I disagree. I love this movie to death. Now on to another one of my favorite categories, the ones you wouldn't expect. These are some of the films that I love that, looking at the rest of this list, may seem a bit out of place or random. I almost call this category guilty pleasures, but you know what? Nah. I don't think you should feel guilty for liking a certain movie. Don't be ashamed of liking something even if it's critically panned or kinda dumb or whatever. As long as you enjoy it, that's what's important. Anyway, National Treasure 1 and 2 and Night at the Museum 1 and 2 are what I would consider the quintessential movies that are on TV in the afternoon. I realize that may not sound like a good thing, but let me explain. They may not seem like monumental films, but I've seen them more times than I can count because they're always on TV, and when I stumble upon them, I rarely object to just sitting down and watching them. They're so much fun, all 4 of them. The National Treasure movies take something I already love, a fun heist film, then add Nicolas Cage and Diane Kruger and the guy who goes missing from The Hangover with their fun dynamic, then mix in some Indiana Jones vibes and plots about stealing the Declaration of Independence and then the President, which leads to some US history stuff, which, as you'll know if you're a longtime subscriber, used to be a big passion of mine. I mean, what is there not to love? And the Night at the Museum films have a fantastic premise that, for what this is executed pretty flawlessly, with fun performances from Ben Stiller and Hank Azaria especially, although there's a great ensemble cast here in general. These films aren't really about the plot, but sort of use the vague threat of each film as a template to explore all the fun possibilities that can come from museum exhibits coming to life. And that leads to 2 extremely fun movies. Freaky Friday 2013 is a very enjoyable, very early 2000s family film with 2 hilarious performances from Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis, and is probably the best body swap movie ever made. It's charming, it's wholesome, it's exactly what you want from this kind of film. Plus, I watched it a ton with my family growing up, so it has that special place in my heart. As does A Series of Unfortunate Events with Jim Carrey. I vaguely remember people getting upset that this movie condensed a lot of the books into one story, but I honestly think this movie pretty perfectly captures the dark, sinister, twisted, but still whimsical and fun world that I remember the books having. Maybe it leans a bit more into the comedy with Jim Carrey's performance, but I have no problem with that. This is one of my favorite Jim Carrey performances. The directing and cinematography are surprisingly great here as well. Then, I'm just gonna say it. Pitch Perfect. Make fun of me if you want, but that movie is goddamn delightful. I don't care what anyone says. Yeah, the other 2 aren't good, but the first one is funny, lighthearted, easy to watch, wholesome fun. Charming performances from everyone, the music is catchy, and the acapella is just pleasant to listen to. I feel weird talking about this, I don't know why. It has a fun finale, it's not the most groundbreaking movie ever made, it's just one that I personally really enjoy. And finally, in this section of movies you might not expect, the second 2 Diary of a Wimpy Kid films, Roderick Rules and Dog Days. Again, like a lot of these I've talked about, movies that I watched as a kid and watched with family and have good memories with and so on and so on, but I genuinely think these 2 movies are really good family comedies. I rewatched both of them recently with my family, and I was genuinely surprised at how much I was laughing out loud. Roderick, played by Devin Bostic, has got to be one of the best characters ever committed to film. Weirdly enough, I didn't like the first film that much. I'm not really sure why. Long time since I've seen that one. But the second 2, yeah, they have their kids' movie humor moments that aren't as funny as you get older, but A, I'd say that's forgivable given that they're kids' movies, and B, the vast majority of them are still really enjoyable. Also, Steve Zahn as the dad, another one of the best performances in movie history. They also have sweet, feel-good moments and endings, they're very quotable.
Pretty sure it spells sweetie, Dad.
Rewatching them recently, I just walked away from them feeling happy, and I love that. And now, for the final category, some films that I love so much that I'll just have to give them their own section, Rocky movies. I have 4 of the 8 Rocky movies here, although it may not be the ones you're expecting. Rocky 1 obviously has to be there. It's a really great, inspiring drama with top-notch acting and contains some of cinema's most iconic moments. A fantastic movie through and through. Then, I really do enjoy Rocky 2, 3, and 4, all pretty much for different reasons. I'll make a whole video on this series someday, but then the other films are actually Rocky Balboa, Creed, and Creed 2. Rocky Balboa is a pretty underappreciated film, I'd say. It's a bit of a remake of Rocky 1, but with the wrinkle, pun not intended, that Rocky is now much older. This isn't like Logan in terms of a really dark look at an older version of a beloved character. It's more light and fun than that, but the way it handles this almost superhero-like character facing something like age is actually done incredibly well. He's slower, he's lost his wife, his relationship with his son is strained. These are more real-world problems that are so effective not only because of how they're handled in the film, but also because we've grown to love Rocky through the years. And also, we've seen the Rocky films get so ridiculous, and we saw this guy as this almost invincible man, and now to bring him back down to earth to face real problems is really powerful. And also, it's actually handled well. I like to think of Rocky 2 to 4 as almost like legends of the Rocky world, like to keep continuity in a series that varies in ridiculousness and seriousness throughout. In this cinematic universe, Rocky 1 is a real thing that happened, Rocky 2 to 4 happened, but the films are the exaggerated fun way someone would retell the story, and then Rocky Balboa and onwards are real again. And then we can just forget about this one, I guess, and Creed 2 is also a bit over the top. I don't know, it doesn't make a ton of sense when you think about it, but I found that a fun way to look at these. But it handles the story extremely well, and then also combines it with the fun Rocky tropes that we love, to produce another underdog Rocky story that's very emotionally satisfying. The training montage is great, the final fight is amazing, and I feel like this video is just making me look like a very, very emotional movie watcher, but everything after that final bell will always make me cry. Rocky and his son having reconnected, Rocky telling Paulie that the beast is finally out, the crowd cheering for Rocky with the music. It's this beautiful, heroic send-off to this character, at least this version of him, the boxer. and it could not have been done better. And then the actual ending of the film crushes your heart in such a bittersweet way. It's a sad ending, but a wholesome ending.
Yo, Adrian, we did it.
I was not expecting this movie to make me feel so much emotion. I do have more to say about this film, believe it or not, but I'll save that for my best and worst of Rocky, coming sometime. And then Creed and Creed 2. Creed is definitely my favorite of these two, but I love both of them. Creed is one of, if not my favorite movie ever. You know how that number one position can switch around quite frequently, but it's up there. I genuinely think it's a perfect film that pretty much anyone can enjoy. I love all of the performances and the characters and their arcs. I love Donnie's journey in the film. I love how the film uses the character of Rocky. The more grounded and down-to-earth style works so well for this story. The boxing scenes are phenomenal, as are the training montages. The film fills me with so many emotions every time I watch it, and it is far and away the most inspirational and motivational film I've ever seen. And it's a film that, as cheesy as it may sound to some people, genuinely changed my life. Now, Creed 2 is a bit like Rocky 2. It's not quite as good as the first, and it's a bit more ridiculous and over the top, but for what Creed 2 is, I still absolutely love this movie. I'm already so attached to these characters, and I think this movie generally carries on those characters in really interesting ways. I think the training and boxing scenes, while more over the top and movie-like, are still amazing, and this movie, again, I personally find extremely inspiring, and I love it for that reason as well. Another film that's had a genuine impact on my personal life. Also, the one thing it does do better than the first Creed, the villains, fantastic, performance and character-wise. And there we go. Now, I know people are wanting a ranking, a top 5 of my favorites, and you know what? I'll kind of oblige that. I'll give a top 11, because I couldn't figure out which of these to cut out. But they are in no particular order, because the order changes constantly. Again, the point of this video is that all of the films I've talked about, I love in different ways. But if I had to narrow it down to the ones I absolutely love the most, if you were to identify me, Benedict, in terms of movies, then those movies would be Creed, La La Land, Birdman, Django Unchained, Kung Fu Panda, Kingsman: The Secret Service, Baby Driver, Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Avengers, the Cornetto Trilogy, I know it's 3 movies and that's cheating, but shh, and The Incredibles. And there you have it, my new, updated favorite movies video and or list. As complete a list as I could make it. I also want to make this into a series of sorts, where I'll say this is the baseline video, and from now on every 6 months or something like that, I can make a little update video of films I've seen since then that I'd consider adding to the list, but for now, these are the movies that I myself love the most in the world. So, that was a big video. What do you think of my list? Let me know that, and all of your thoughts down below in the comments. While you're at it, be sure to like this video, check out my Instagram and Twitter at BHL_Hudson, check out this podcast about movies and TV and whatnot I do with a friend of mine called The Poorly Planned Podcast, and subscribe for more videos like the one you just watched. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.